What's up, everybody? Thralls Metal here once again. I'm a Crockneck, and I have something kind of new for you, and actually something I've been wanting to discuss or find some sort of video outlet to go over in terms of like a multi-part series. So we're going to go over bands that are heavy, but maybe aren't necessarily metal, or are they? This is always up for debate. There's a lot of bands in here that we cover that aren't necessarily metal, but they are heavy in a certain way. Whether they fall under that alt metal sort of umbrella or they're kind of like outliers, you know, in terms of like, you know, grunge or hard rock. Either way, they have a certain heaviness to them that, while maybe isn't always very metallic, they kind of still attract the same fan bases. People that want heavy, aggressive music or just heavy, emotional music. So there are a litany of bands to select from in terms of this sort of heavy but not metal thing. And I wanted to get this started with a good handful because I do plan on doing this again. But I also wanted to say that none of this is based on whether or not this band I bring up is on the archives. Some of these bands are definitely not on the archives for a pretty good reason because, I mean, the argument as to whether or not they're metal is pretty substantial. But with each of these bands, I want to go over their sound, whether or not it has metallic elements, or why their heavier sound is not necessarily very metallic, and even right down to like whether or not they were part of a scene, or you know, what sort of fans they attract, whether or not there's a lot of crossover with metal fans. There's a lot of stuff to actually go over in here, and that's kind of why I've been excited to do this for a while. So we're going to open this one up with probably the oldest band I have on this list, Killing Joke. Killing Joke has always had sort of a more harsh appeal to them in terms of their style. One of the pioneers of post-punk and one of the biggest influences in industrial metal too. This band has always seemed to have like a more gritty underbelly to their sound, regardless of the directions they've chose, because over the years this band's sound has morphed and changed and gone from, you know, more lush and atmospheric to more heavy and biting, and even in some cases a more metallic sounding heavy. Their influence has been all over heavy music in general. In fact, the first time I ever heard of this band was back when I was a teen, jamming the Garage Days covers from Metallica. They covered The Weight, and I was unfamiliar with the band they were covering, and I decided to check them out, and lo and behold, I found something that kind of echoed a little bit of what I was listening to as a teen too, with Ministry and industrial metal. And even over the years, I have found that it is not uncommon for metal bands to cover Killing Joke. Fear Factory's covered them, Prong has covered them, The Amenta has recently covered them. Actually, they covered a really metallic track too. But I will say with this band, it's all a matter of when you catch them. When you got them at their most pissed and most feral, they tend to put out heavier music. Albums like 1994's Pandemonium features good heavy tracks like Millennium, and the absolutely feral sounding Exorcism, which is just driven by stomping rhythms and very metallic riffs. Their 2003 self-titled album with Dave Grohl on drums features a lot of heavy metallic riffs. Asteroid in particular is a very metallic song on there. The chunky, heavy riffs on Total Invasion as well. There's definitely a more metallic feel than there is a post-punk feel to that one. You can also find more metallic tracks on albums like Extremities Dirt and Various Repressed Emotions, Pylon, and Hosannas in the Basement of Hell. Now, as to whether or not I think this band is a metal band, not really, but I will say they write metal songs every now and then. Even on their album Absolute Descent, when they were doing interviews, they said, yeah, we wrote some songs with a more metal feel to them every now and then because that is kind of part of our sound, but our sound as a whole has a lot of elements. And to call this band a metal band would be unfair because there's a lot of other stuff that they cover. I would say they are like probably the heaviest of the OG post-punk bands. And for a band that isn't metal, they have had a substantial impact on metal and just heavy music in general. Hell, I've even heard this band called U2 with riffs. Unlike U2 though, I'm sure there's less people going, turn that off. I swear I've heard that song too many times. But yeah, Killing Joke, I know, definitely one to be debated there, and kind of more or less one that it depends on when you catch them in their career. Also, speaking of riffs, rest in peace, Geordie, the band's longtime guitarist, recently passed earlier this year. His guitar work was such a huge part of this band's sound overall, and he will be sorely missed. All right, next up, and this is kind of the start of a tree in a way, we have Helmet. Now, Helmet kind of occupied some interesting territory in the early 90s in particular. They kind of rode the grunge wave into, I would say, some modest popularity, even though they really didn't have their roots in that grunge sound. They were more of a post-hardcore slash noise rock band formed in New York. And while they did have some singles that had modest success, like Unsung and Milquetoast, a lot of their early stuff, namely in the first 3 albums, was very gnarly, squawky, down-tuned, kind of muddy and sludgy, and decidedly more heavy than any of their album covers ever let on. There was kind of like a secret heavy, like you looked at it, you thought of it as an alternative band, and then when you put it on and cranked it because you thought it was going to sound like Blind Melon or something, it came out just heavier than hell and with harsh vocals and just sort of a biting, visceral sound. Hell, if you saw pictures of them back then, they just looked like normal dudes. Like, they didn't even kind of have the grunge look going. They just looked like, yeah, this dude just got off of work someplace and this is what he was wearing to the photo shoot. Which by photo shoot, I mean one of their buddies had a Polaroid camera and told him to stand in a dimly lit hallway. Now, despite the fact that Page Hamilton had a history in jazz guitar, everything about Helmet was very minimalist and very heavy and just kind of biting. Like the vocals, again, like more desperate kind of hardcore yells, lots of groove, and these just squawky, dissonant, ugly leads all over the place. If you could even call them leads, they were more or less just walls of noise that just kind of made it a little bit more chaotic sounding. And groove was also a huge part of their sound. John Steiner's drums generally drove the songs. They had kind of a hardcore bounce to them. And in terms of influencing metal, I would definitely say they influenced a lot of sludge metal, metallic hardcore, and even nu metal. Nu metal definitely cites Helmet as a big influence just in terms of those grooves and those minimalist sort of down-tuned riffs. As to whether or not they are metal, I'd say there's room for an argument, at least with the first 3 albums, maybe 4. I mean, Aftertaste is okay. But generally, I would say they're more of a post-hardcore band or just one of those weird 90s bands that were just kind of hard to classify, even though they were heavy enough to kind of run with the metal crowd and even tour with a lot of the acts. And believe me, we're going to cover a lot of those bands. I'll be honest though, when it comes down to fans of Helmet, generally Helmet fans are metal fans, at least in my experience. Almost every person that I have talked to that has been a Helmet fan has also been a fan of just metal in general, like whether it's thrash or death metal or sludge or whatever. Generally, if this prospective person I'm talking to is a fan of Helmet, there are definitely other metal bands that person likes. Meantime is probably the big essential out of them all. I still jam that album all the time. It is one of my favorite albums of the 90s and honestly still influences a lot of my taste today. Now, as I said, this is kind of the start of a tree, and this next band I have probably referenced in the same breath with Helmet, and that is Quicksand. Quicksand was another one of these kind of post-hardcore bands that popped up in the 90s that definitely took a lot of influence from what Helmet was doing and then combined it with bands like Jane's Addiction and Fugazi. And what you had was something that was still very heavy, like you still had big, massive riffs, good grooves, but I think a little bit more of a punk background and definitely a little bit more on the melodic side. One of the main guys behind the project, guitarist and frontman Walter Schippels, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, his roots were definitely more in the punk and hardcore scene. He came from a band called Youth of Today, and after that wanted to do something that was a little bit heavier and a little bit more melodic, but at the same time, like, not necessarily just like the straightforward punk and hardcore, but rather something that had like a different kind of heaviness to it. And while throughout Quicksand's earlier albums, there was definitely a heavier tone to it, but it also had that kind of dirty, squawky sound that definitely came from the punk side of things. And while this band was heavily influenced by Helmet, I would say that they had maybe a little bit more of a gift for melody. The songs, while they had all the heavy riffs and angsty vocals, there was always an element of melody and, honestly some solid hooks across their songs in general. Like, there are good choruses that repeat. They also had very relatable lyrics for a very young fan base, like a lot of angsty teenager stuff. I definitely related to a lot of the stuff they were talking about, just being a shitty teenager for years. But when it came down to the melodies, they found this good balance between stuff that will appeal to a more metal slash hardcore crowd and even a crowd that was listening to stuff like Smashing Pumpkins and, the more grunge-centric stuff. They found that sweet spot in between there, and to a degree, I think they had a lot of success with that, especially with their breakout album, Slip. Now, I got in this band with the follow-up album, Manic Compressions, which I think is a little bit more polished polished overall, but I still kind of gravitate a little bit more towards Slip just because I love those riffs on there. Those big sludgy lurching riffs in that song I just find absolutely infectious. I've even heard some metal bands cover that one too, so yeah, I think this band has an appeal to metalheads, but when it comes down to like fans that I have talked to in terms of like Quicksand fans, it's kind of all over the place. Like generally, I don't see like a strictly metal fan base there. It's a very mixed crowd. You get a lot of people that are more into the punk side of things and really didn't cross over into metal at all. But at the same time, you still have metalheads who go like, yeah, no, they write good, catchy songs and they're pretty heavy for what they do. Me personally, I don't think I would call them a metal band. It's almost like kind of that heavy alternative, post-hardcore kind of fits too. Again, it's one of those 90s bands where they were heavy, but describing their particular brand of heavy was difficult, especially when you tried to say like, oh, well, they're metal, maybe. But regardless, I love all their albums. All 4 of their albums are absolutely awesome. Their first EPs, it's okay, but all 4 of their albums, I think, are really solid pieces of work. I've really loved their 2 reunion albums. Their last one, Distant Populations in particular, I think is just absolutely catchy as hell, and honestly, I think it might be one of their best, but again, I like them all. Either way, solid band, strongly recommend them, and we're going to get on to another band that is very similar and almost sort of an evolution of that sound with Hum. Now, unlike Helmet and Quicksand, Hum was not part of the New York scene because they weren't from New York. I believe they were from the Midwest. But they kind of had elements of that, but they also added a different wrinkle with shoegaze. Now, shoegaze and I have a tenuous relationship. Sometimes I think it's awesome. Sometimes I think it is the most boring thing on the planet. But with this band, they kind of fit in with the heavy grunge pack at the same time, and they also kind of fit in with like the Helmet and Quicksand sort of sound. And well, I ended up really liking them, even though I didn't know I really liked them at the time, because this band is often known for their one big hit, Stars. While this band had 2 albums out before You'd Prefer an Astronaut, most people know that album, or at least know the song Stars. Oddly enough, most people that I've run into that know that song have no idea what the band's name that does it. But it's often known for the very soft start, the very wispy vocals, and then all of a sudden just this big heavy riff comes in, and then the song shifts to this very heavy song that, while maybe isn't metal, is definitely just, I don't know, kind of ripping. At least as far as I have listened, and I admittedly have not listened to their first 2 very much, this band always had a big guitar sound. It is very dominant in the mix, and it is a arguably metallic sounding guitar tone. It's thick, it's sludgy, it's got a good crunch to it, but when you combine that with the contrast of the very breathy vocals and some of the shoegazy atmosphere in here, it creates this sort of conundrum as to whether or not this band is metal. And I would say that was kind of an issue in terms of like where to place them and where they fit in terms of like tours, or, you know, like the MTV rotation. Like, do you put them on like a heavier rotation for more like, you know, bands that are on the cusp of metal, or do you kind of mix them in with all the Smashing Pumpkins and, you know, Stone Temple Pilots stuff? They really didn't kind of fit in anywhere, and that would kind of show in terms of like, well, what happened after Stars blew up. That was the only song that really blew up, and while You'd Prefer an Astronaut did well in terms of sales, the follow-up, Downward is Heavenward, which in some respects I think is a better album, didn't do well at all. In fact, it's largely forgotten, which, you know, it kind of relates to the whole Stars thing. Like, everyone loved that song, but no one seemed to know who did it. Now, this band would break up after Downward is Heavenward, but would come back in, I believe, gosh, like the 2010s. I can't remember the exact year it came out, but the album was Inlet, and I picked it up after hearing 1 track because, honestly, this is their heaviest release I think they have in their discography. The guitars feel way more just heavy, chunky, more lush, down-tuned. And while, again, I'm not necessarily sure it's metal, it feels more metallic. It feels more like a post-metal album in terms of its atmosphere, the longer songs, and, again, deceptively heavy. This band is kind of unassuming in a lot of characteristics. Like, you look at the band pictures, you look at their album covers. Most of the time, you wouldn't think for a second that this would be remotely heavy music at all, but you'd be surprised. So as to whether or not I think they're metal, maybe with this last one, again, it kind of has, you know, a little bit more of a post-metal vibe. Like, you could still make the shoegaze argument, which shoegaze is definitely a part of their sound, but that one does have a slightly more metallic feel in a way. But overall, I'm not really sure where this band belongs, but that's kind of been like the story of their career. In terms of fans of this band, well, I mean, I definitely run into like some crossover with some more metal fans, and honestly, with the next band that I'm bringing up here, there's also a lot of crossover appeal there, and there's probably a good reason. But in terms of recommendation, I would say definitely check out You'd Prefer an Astronaut and the last album, Inlet. Inlet in particular might be my new favorite. Not just because it's, you know, the heaviest one, but I feel like the production, the whole vibe of the album, it's just very catchy. So check out this band, you know, that you might have actually heard before and you just didn't know was them. All right, the next one up, and I've alluded to them and even kind of telegraphed them ever so slightly, Deftones. Deftones has always been one of those bands that has navigated its way in between the metal crowds and the alt-rock crowds, and has somehow kind of found a home in both. We went over their last album, Ohms, and we even asked in that review if they were metal, and we got a litany of responses in the comments. Either way, I love Deftones. I've been a fan of Deftones since, God, I was in high school. Now, out of most of these bands, I would maybe argue that this band is a little bit more metal than some of the other ones that I've brought up, mainly because they kind of start off in the new metal category, which I know to some people that isn't metal, but it is. It's more likely just metal you don't like. But their first two albums, Adrenaline and Around the Fur, definitely have their place in the new metal Hall of Fame, because I see them as two of the big landmark albums in that subgenre, and I mean, honestly, probably some of the best in terms of new metal in general. But this band has always been influenced by a wide array of different bands. I've even heard Adrenaline referred to as a Cure album for fans of suicidal tendencies. It's, you know, got its feet firmly planted in the metal side with, you know, the heavier riffs on there. There's a lot of good chuggy, kind of thrashy riffs on there. But at the same time, you have Chino's very breathy, evocative crooning, which definitely leans itself more towards, you know, The Cure, Morrissey, or The Smiths, and stuff like that. And that blend of those two things kind of comes together in one of their other big influences, which was Hum early on, as well as Helmet. The band has definitely covered Helmet more than once, I believe. But honestly, it's that wide array of different influences that makes Deftones sound, you know, so complex and hard to describe in terms of whether or not it's metal or not, because on one side, you know, Chino's vocals definitely sort of dominate this more alternative feel. They're very wispy. Yes, he can scream his guts out, but at the same time, his clean delivery is honestly even more standout than his screaming. But on the other side, you have Stephen Carpenter, whose guitar style is generally very metallic. Like, when it comes down to his heavier, chuggier riffs, you know, it gives this band a distinctly metal sound when those moments pop up. He's made no secret of his love of Meshuggah, Fear Factory, and all sorts of old school thrash metal, and I think that comes out in his playing, but he also does well at generating atmospheric textures as well as just these big, nasty, heavy riffs. So you get this cool balance. But like Hum, the contrast is sort of the big thing, and the contrast is the thing that kind of makes this band hard to call a metal band. That and every album seems to showcase both sides of their sound really well. One second you could be lured in the atmospheric sort of ether of Chino's delivery, and then he starts screaming his guts out, and then the next second you're just being run over by bottom heavy chugs from 7-string to 8-string to, I believe now, 9-string guitars. So he's all about this giant heavy tone, and it just is absolutely massive sounding. So pretty much throughout their entire career, they've had this cool balance of delicacy and ferocity, and I like both sides of this band. Now, as to whether or not they are a metal band, this one, oddly, I would argue maybe they are. Like, this is one that you can kind of throw in the alt metal sort of bin where we throw in a lot of heavier bands that we just like, it's not this or this, so alt metal, and kind of forget. But honestly, I think it kind of does fit there, because, I mean, Stephen Carpenter's guitar tone alone is heavier than hell, and the way he plays it, he plays very metallic riffs. So I think that gives it more of a, you know, metallic edge than, say, like Helmet or Quicksand. And as for the fans, I mean, it's interesting. You get a good mix there. Like, I've met Deftones fans that really don't listen to anything else, like, super heavy. Like, they don't go, you know, more towards any of, like, Steph's big influences, like Meshuggah or Fear Factory or anything like that. And on the other hand, I know a lot of metalheads that still really love this band. In fact, you know, as much as a lot of metalheads dog nu metal, this is kind of one of the bands that they just kind of like, no, they're fine. And I mean, to a degree, you could say only their first 2 albums are really nu metal. Everything else after that has been constantly evolving and becoming more atmospheric and, you know, expressive in different ways, and really has kind of lost that nu metal touch. Like there's, you know, rapping. Even Mike Delgado's DJ work is barely DJ work. Like it's more soundscapes and synths now, and I think he absolutely excels at that. So pretty much as their sound keeps evolving, I would say also their appeal does. And I mean, in terms of their most metallic releases, you know, I mean, the first 2 definitely have a lot of flat out metal riffs on them. But in terms of one of their absolute heaviest albums, I would still say Diamond Eyes is way up there. The guitar tone on that is absolutely lethal, and there is a sort of urgency to that album, you know, namely because this was the first one they did after the, you know, death of Chi Chang. They wanted to get out there and just kind of reestablish themselves in terms of their heavier side and still balance it out with all the cool atmospheric touches that they're known for. But that album in particular just has some particularly vicious tracks. Like you've seen a Butcher, that heavy syncopated chug is just awesome, and Rocket Skates in particular, that song's just got a nasty riff to it. But yeah, across the board, I would probably recommend all their albums, even Gore, which I'm still kind of iffy on. It still has some great tracks. This band occupies like an interesting territory in terms of heavy music in general, and I would still argue that they are metal, but I could definitely hear arguments as to why they're not. Either way, I think they're an awesome, eclectic band that keeps going today, and that we'll get into the next one, especially in terms of a band being eclectic, with Faith No More. Faith No More, man, well, describing this band, again, you could go song to song, say, like, oh no, they're a metal band, punk band, funk band, occasionally like alt country, blues rock, there's occasionally some jazz too. It's Faith No More. Faith No More is Faith No More, and that's the thing that I have loved about them since I saw the Epic video. Kind of blew me away when I was in 6th grade. Faith No More is one of those bands that kind of just fits in that weird 90s experimentation. Like, I know they started off in the 80s, and granted, Real Thing came out in 89. It didn't take off until 90, I would say. But even then, going back and listening to all their stuff, which I frequent Faith No More often because Mike Patton is one of my favorite vocalists of all time, this band is still impossible to really pigeonhole under one genre. Like, yeah, you could call them alternative, but that only covers a portion of their sound. And it's the same for any other thing you would want to call them. Like, yeah, you could call them metal. There's a lot of metallic riffs, especially during Jim Martin's tenure. He had some great metallic riffs across the board. Even back when Chuck Mosley was in the band, he still had good metallic riffs. And I mean, part of that is he came from the Bay Area thrash scene. He played in a band called Vicious Hatred. And I believe he also jammed with Cliff Burton for a little while too. So he's got like some serious metal cred going into this weird, quirky band. So while I will say the band sound was all over the place during the Jim Martin era, he always kind of anchored it with some like good, heavy, you know, more metal riffs. But that even goes beyond Jim Martin. They still had more metal moments when Trey Spruance joined after Jim Martin left, and then John Hudson too. While his style is very minimalistic, there's still a good metal edge that pops up every now and then. And regardless of who's playing them, when the guitars are heavy, there's a good like metal kind of crunch to them. It doesn't sound like a very thin, you know, rock tone at all. It sounds like a metal tone. But I will say, when Mike Patton joined the band from Mr. Bungle, which I left Bungle off here because I was already going over Faith No More, I figured that would be enough Mike Patton, but, you know, I might save it for another video. But when Mike Patton joined, the fact that his vocal range and his delivery was so eclectic, the band had an opportunity to really explore a lot of different sounds and a lot of different styles, and they did. And while I think that may have cost them a little bit of additional fame, like they could have wrote just straightforward singles, they could have wrote like songs like Epic again, but they kept choosing to write, you know, vastly different songs from one another and kind of create their own weird sound that was distinctly them. And well, that became the thing that was like the main appeal of Faith No More. You didn't really know what you're going to get track to track, but generally it would be pretty damn awesome. So when it comes down to the fan base, I would say Faith No More fans are Faith No More fans. Granted, a good chunk of them that I run into are also metalheads, but you'll find that they listen to like a variety of different weird things too. Of course, with any band that was popular, you might run into someone that's just a fan of the single, like, oh yeah, man, I love Epic. And that's cool, but you barely have your foot in the door. There's a lot of stuff to check out. And in terms of their more heavy moments out there, like the ones that I would say are flat out metal songs like Caffeine, Cuckoo for Caca, Surprise, You're Dead. Malpractice is a banger too. BT Band covered that one and did a great job. This band is, I don't know, just Faith No More. Like, you can just kind of leave it at that, and most people that know the band would just go, yeah, we totally agree. Are they metal? Yeah, no, kinda. They're also this and this and this. Ultimately, it doesn't matter because the band's just flat out awesome. It's one of my favorite bands, probably of all time. And in terms of like 90s listening, in terms of that whole era where I think music kind of just got a little fun and weird again, absolutely essential listens. So yeah, the 90s were full of strange, heavy oddities, and we're going to get into another one with melvins. Melvins are a whole other ball of wax. They are just uniquely them, but at the same time, their influence can be heard all over. Well, in the early 80s, they were definitely noted for being one of the founding grunge bands, along with like Nirvana, Green River, I guess, was in that mix too. They also became one of the biggest influences to one particular style of metal in general, which is sludge metal. Namely with their early works, Gluey Porch Treatments, Ozma, and Bullhead, you know, definitely being that big, gnarly, heavy sound with the weird song structure, their strange vocals. Buzz is just a maniac. His music is as crazy as his damn hair. But a ton of sludge metal bands have cited melvins as like a giant influence. I Hate God, Mastodon, Kylesa. There's just a lot of melvins worship across the board with sludge. And, you know, when you hear those early albums, that massively heavy tone, it's thick, it's almost obnoxious, and at that point, kind of unheard of. They kind of just took that kind of stoner fuzz sort of sound, like that kind of Black Sabbath sort of heaviness, and then just beefed up the crunch, and then just got strange. Like, this band is just flat out weird on a lot of levels. Like, if you try to break down the lyrical schemes, I don't know exactly what you're gonna get. Like, I have been listening to Melvin since I was in high school, and lyrically, I still don't fully understand what they're talking about. Sometimes it's just complete gibberish. Sometimes it's maybe something deep and, you know, metaphorical. I don't know. It just ends up being strange, but I'm mostly there for the riffs, the grooves, and just this overall strangely heavy sound. That early run of albums in particular, which also includes Houdini and Sonar Rich, which are two of my favorites, kind of put them in, like, again, this weird sort of like flux position where they would tour with metal bands and such. Like, they did a big tour with White Zombie around the time of, I believe it was Houdini or Stoner Witch, but they were also still touring with like just strange grunge bands and such. But much like Killing Joke, it kind of depended on when you caught them in terms of whether or not you were going to get their more metal side of their sound. Because that early run of albums was definitely very influential to sludge metal as a whole, and it definitely is very heavy. But then you get to albums like Stag, which is kind of transitional. Well, that album features one of my favorite songs, The Bit, and it's very heavy. It's actually, I would say, a flat-out metal song overall. The rest of the album gets very strange and experimental, and they would enter a kind of long, weird experimental phase after that. I would say all the way up to 2006's A Senile Animal, where they got to the two-drummer phase and got weird in a different way, but also brought back like the heavy, sludgy riffs. In fact, that is, you know, one of my favorite albums in terms of that era of melvins. What's interesting about that era is they included Big Business as part of the band, which Big Business is very similar to melvins in their own right. A band that I considered bringing up on this list, but I figured it'd be kind of pointless to bring them up if I already have melvins on here, so maybe save that for a different video. But during this whole Big Business run, they really kind of returned to their roots in terms of like getting back to that heavier sound. And heavy wasn't just with the tone. Like, there's a lot of bands out there that rock heavy tones that aren't necessarily metal. I've already been over a couple of them. But even in the Melvins riff style and construction, there's a lot of metal elements to it. Kind of, you know, blending stoner metal and doom metal, and again, sludge, which I could say is kind of one of their things that they helped pioneer again. So when they choose to be heavy, it is kind of a specifically metal heavy. But the fact that they keep shifting, you know, back and forth between like that heavier older sound or some more experimental stuff or even just some flat out rock albums, Honestly, when a Melvins album comes out, you're really not sure what you're going to get, but if you're like me, there's a good chance you're probably going to buy it. But that always kind of kept them from being labeled explicitly a metal band, despite them being very influential to metal overall, at least, one particular style, I would say. And like a lot of eclectic, strange bands, their fan base is also, a lot of the same. Like, you definitely have a lot of metalheads in there. You have fans of more avant-garde music, noise rock, and all that stuff. It's really kind of a blend when it comes down to Melvins fans. I've run into all types. I've even run into ones that aren't really metal fans at all, but they like the Melvins just because they're the Melvins. And I suppose that's all the reason you need. So as to whether or not I would say they're metal, it's one of those, depends on when you catch them. Like, at their heaviest, I would say yeah. Like, those early albums, dude, especially Ozma and Gluey Porch Treatments, Bullhead too. I mean, those are very heavy albums. Those are dense, murky, and there's a lot of like metal riffs on there. But if you're considering the band's entire discography, it's kind of hard to call them just a metal band. They're just Melvins. And honestly, I don't really have a problem with that. There's quite a few bands where I just like the band in general just because they have their own sound, like their own unique appeal. And that is definitely Melvins. And since we brought up grunge, we might as well get into the next one, which is Alice in Chains. Probably one of the most well-known ones on here. I mean, this band has sold millions of albums. In fact, they still hold the record for the highest-selling EP of all time with Jarflies, which is absolutely amazing. But it's interesting that I find that this band's status as a metal band is really debated a lot more than I thought it was. Initially, I got into them with Facelift. Of course, Man in the Box blew up. And I kind of just labeled them, a grunge band. It seemed simple. They looked the part. They kind of sound the part, but listening to them over the years, I can definitely hear the metal argument more. I mean, they initially started off as a hair metal band and kind of morphed into the grunge metal band that they are. This band kind of feels like the metal band that kind of snuck in the grunge scene. Like, they just put on some flannel and everyone's like, yeah, no, they're one of us. And, even when you break down their sound, yeah, they had a lot of elements of stuff you would hear in a ton of grunge bands, but there's a lot of metal elements. Like, mainly the guitar tone always felt heavier and more doomy than, honestly, like most of the grunge scene. There was always something a little bit more sinister and doomy to their sound overall, whether it was the combination of the just dreary guitar riffs and the lead melodies, or the absolutely haunting vocal harmonies that were amazingly catchy too, by Jerry Cantrell and Lane Staley. There was just something that appealed to the darker side of, that whole scene, and definitely bordered on metal. Like, you listen to Dirt now, and it honestly sounds more like a metal album that's kind of closer to like sludge or doom metal rather than a grunge band. Like, if you put that up against like a Pearl Jam album or most of like STP's stuff, it definitely sounds different. There's a whole different vibe and atmosphere to Alice in Chains sound that is carried on throughout their career that, again, makes them appeal a little bit more towards metalheads. That and the fact that there are flat-out metal riffs. And also, you can hear it from the start. Like, if you listen to Facelift now, it's produced more like a metal album. Like, just the overall sound of it, like, because, a lot of grunge sounded very raw at first. They sounded more polished right out of the gate. Like, you listen to the snare on that album, like, it's kind of a big glam metal snare. Like, it's big and washy, like a little bit of 80s carryover there. And then on Dirt, rather than kind of softening up their image or their sound, they actually got heavier and darker, whereas a lot of the other, grunge bands were starting to go for more of that accessibility and kind of just get that, giant paycheck. But for me, one of the weirdest things was when I was growing up in high school, being a metalhead, I was also a grunge fan. But the grunge fans constantly shit on metal. They were constantly dogging on, like, maybe Metallica's all right, but all these metal bands are losers now, and blah, 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 and it's just not cool anymore, and check out my new flannel and my Doc Martens, and yeah, no, I got kind of sick of that because I also liked, this grunge sound too, but I love my metal. But for some odd reason, not a single one of the grunge fans would acknowledge the metal side of Alice in Chains. Like, it's like, no, man, they're a grunge band, they're a rock band, they're, part of the thing that I like and totally not a part of the thing that you like. I don't know, it was like some weird 90s specific cognitive dissonance that, I don't know, I think we're completely over that now because pretty much a ton of Alice in Chains fans that I run into are also metalheads too. Like, there is a metallic appeal to Alice in Chains, despite, you know, the dreary, somber ballads that they pretty much just nail across the board. Like, this band, I would say, has a flat-out perfect discography. I love all of their stuff. So I think there is definitely an argument to be made here that maybe Alice in Chains is just like kind of a secret metal band that popped up in the grunge age, and maybe it's taken till now to really acknowledge that. Much like with any of these bands, it doesn't necessarily matter if they're metal or not. I'll probably still love them. But I really feel like this one, you can make a solid argument here that this band was a metal band, and still is, because they're still cranking out music, even though it's been a little while since Rain Air Fog, and I would really like a new one. But they have a consistent sound that relies on heavy, dark, dreary music. And honestly, I would feel as though they would fit in on a bill with a lot of stoner metal and doom metal bands too. Like, there's a similar vibe there. But yeah, I don't know. I kind of feel like they're a metal band. But I can definitely hear arguments as to why they're not. Again, it really doesn't matter. This band's discography speaks for itself. It's just nothing but the best. So for this next one, we are leaving the US entirely, and we are going to talk about Kvelertak. This has been a more recent band that has popped up that has confounded people that want to try to classify them as something and still kind of struggle to do that every time they listen to an album. But I have become a giant fan over the last, I would say 10 years. And when it comes down to saying what this band is in terms of one particular style, I still struggle. And one of the main reasons I struggle in here is because it's such a cool homogenized blend of so many things. You have classic rock, classic heavy metal, punk, black metal, hardcore, there's even alternative rock in there. This band kind of does everything, but unlike, you know, say like a band like Faith No More, where they can separate it track by track, like, yes, this is the more jazzy track, this is the more metal track, this is the more bluesy track. This band will kind of squeeze it all together and kind of blend it all. Now, I've seen this band labeled as black and roll a couple of times. I do think that is fitting, but again, there are other elements at play in their sound that I think just kind of get excluded when you call them black and roll. And for the record, I didn't bring up this band just because the Archives is once again like, I don't know about that band, but they're like that about a lot of bands, and that's probably a subject for a different video. The thing that really draws me in about this band is songwriting and melody. While this band is very heavy, they have a lot of that punk attitude that can be vicious as hell, and predominantly the vocals are very harsh. They really know how to write good, solid hooks. There are great guitar harmonies across all of their albums, which I don't know if I wrote down. Let me look at my notes. Maybe. Either way, I'm not very good at pronouncing them. Almost everything they've put out has been in Norwegian. There are a few songs that aren't, namely because they have some guest stars on there that don't speak Norwegian, and, well, it would probably help if they didn't have to for the song. But across the board, you get this cool blend of so many different styles, and again, just hooks left and right. But it still maintains like a good, aggressive, metallic punch, and different kinds of metal. Like, you get like classic Iron Maiden harmonies that'll pop up in a song, and then the next one will have cold black metal tremolos with harsh screams on top, and then out of nowhere they can shift to like power pop hooks you would hear on a Foo Fighters album or like a Cheap Trick album. And the thing is, it all works. Across every album, this band just flat out nails it. I love this entire discography so far. So as for their status as a metal band or not, there's definitely an argument to be made. You know, there's definitely a lot of like hard rock bands that, you know, take from like classic heavy metal like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, but there are very few like flat out rock bands that will take from black metal. And this band definitely employs a lot of black metal in their cold tremolos, but again, you listen to like the chord progressions, they're not always those dark, sinister chords. They're occasionally very bright and very poppy and very hooky. So that's the thing that might keep them off the metal spectrum, and you can call them more of a hard rock band. So this one could go either way. I don't know what I'm comfortable calling with. I, again, don't know how to describe this band other than just catchy, aggressive music with good hooks to it. The 3-guitar attack this band has, I think, is absolutely fantastic, and the layers of guitar harmonies and interplay is absolutely amazing. It makes the songs really jump out as far as like the guitar work and then the cool vocal melodies on top of that, because these guys do throw in some good clean choruses too. And in terms of the fan base of this band, I would say most of them are predominantly metalheads, and I think that may have a lot to do with the vocals. Generally, you know, the vocals have always been a point of contention with people that aren't necessarily metal fans. Like, oh, they're too harsh, they're screaming, I don't like it. So by that, you can definitely see why they appeal more to metalheads, because that's just a day in the office for us. But I would like legit play this for someone that wasn't necessarily a metalhead, and if I could get them to not focus on the vocals being harsh and screamy and just have them follow the riffs and the music, I think anyone could really like this band. Either way, I love this band. Again, all of their albums are fantastic. Knatsford is one I particularly like. I don't know if I said that one right. Split is fantastic too. Endling, self-titled, Mirror. I think I named all of them. Yeah, just check them all out. This band is just uniquely catchy and fun, and definitely worth checking out. So next up, we're kind of gonna move back to the States again and get back into, well, kind of a Melvins worship band, but kind of not. We're going to talk about Dub Trio. Now, base level, you could say that this band is definitely a Melvins worship band, even though their background isn't necessarily in the grunge scene. When this band plays heavier music, which their style is definitely a blend of a lot of different elements, but their heavier side is very much in the realm of Melvins style sludge. Massive fuzzy bass, heavy drums, and of course that token sludgy sound. It's definitely very metallic at times, but this band, well, isn't called Dub Trio for not having dub in there. This band brings in a lot of dub and reggae influences and lots of spacey shoegaze atmosphere as well. So again, you get this kind of give and take with two different styles being vastly different from one another. This is another one where I'd say they are deceptively heavy. You know, both again in the fact that they don't have a name that necessarily screams we're metal. They don't have album covers that necessarily scream they're metal. But when you listen to them, believe me, on those heavier sections, I think the only thing you would probably think of is metal. Like, especially someone that doesn't listen to a lot of heavy music, like the first riffs that you hear pop up on the opening track on Another Sound is Dying, you're just going to think you bought a metal album. This band also frequently attracts a lot of metal guests. Mike Patton has played with this band. In fact, this band was his backing band when he decided to do the Peeping Tom tour. Troy Sanders from Mastodon has been on one of their albums, and even King Buzzo from Melvin. So they attract a lot of, you know, people from heavier bands, but this band's background is very interesting because a good chunk of them actually do a lot of stuff in hip hop, and you can definitely hear that in a lot of the rhythms on here. Like there's a lot of like kind of like R&B swings and, you know, like fun jazzy grooves. When it comes down to a lot of the rhythms on here, it doesn't feel, you know, explicitly very metal. Like, yeah, they're played very heavily, lots of like heavy crash and ride, but lots of like fun accents that you would find more in the hip-hop realm, I guess. Now, when it comes down to guests, though, it is kind of interesting because those are generally the only vocals you'll hear. This band is predominantly instrumental across the board, so it doesn't necessarily give it like a metal appeal in terms of a vocal style. They have to outsource for that, and often they just don't. A lot of these songs are just instrumental jams, and again, they kind of just go wherever they want to. Some of their big atmospheric sections kind of have a shoegazy sort of vibe. And then you have the more reggae-ish sections that pop up. So again, you get like a blend of styles, but it's when they get heavy is when you can start to make that metal argument. They kind of fit in with the strange sort of like niche heavy bands from the 90s and such, even though I believe they're more of like a late 90s band. But in terms of calling them metal, you could make an argument at their heavier moments on here. It's more akin to stoner metal and doom metal, like right down to the production. The guitars have a more metallic sludge stoner doom sort of sound when they get heavy, but there's a lot of other stuff going on too. So while they're not purely a metal band, I think the more metallic elements that shine in their stuff, you can definitely make an argument, especially on albums like The Shape of Dub to Come, Another Sound is Dying, and New Heavy. All three of those albums definitely have big, heavy moments, and honestly, they're just fantastic listens for the most part. The front half of A Shape of Dub to Come, I think, is fantastic, and then the back half just kind of gets a little weird and atmospheric. But overall, I think this band kind of falls a bit under the Melvins worship, but they kind of do their own thing and put their own spin on it, which I think is pretty awesome. Heavy music generally embraces the strange, and that kind of curtails in the next one here, which is Primus. Primus is kind of a fan favorite. In fact, I would say this band has like quite a cult of a fan base, and I proudly count myself among their members. I've been a Primus fan since, again, my teenage years, and this band has always occupied strange territory because this band is uniquely them. There really is not another band out there that I would say sounds like Primus, and to some, namely their detractors, that's probably a really good thing. Yet another weird band from the 90s that was kind of known for their quirkiness and their strange sound in terms of blending funk and heavy rock and kind of alternative. It's interesting, though, because two of the members on here have ties to the metal scene, namely out in the Bay Area. Larry Lalonde was on Possessed's legendary debut, Seven Churches, and that gives him tons of metal cred. And Les Claypool was on Blind Illusion's debut, which are strange in their own right, but definitely a metal band. And he even famously tried out for Metallica, which they said he was due not for Metallica, I guess. I don't know. Personally, I just think he was just too damn good. Either way, it kind of worked out in their benefit because this band just sort of took off in the underground and had this very strange, unique, kind of funky, weird sound. Their image was, I don't know, not necessarily metal, but I don't know, just kind of odd. Like, they didn't even fit in with the grunge crowd, and the grunge crowd was really bringing in a lot of the strange bands too, but this band was just possibly too quirky for them with their odd lyrical subject matter, and Les's just extraordinary bass playing. Like, that dude is a god tier bassist. I don't think I need to tell anyone that. But at times, this band definitely has its metal appeal. Like, if you go back and listen to Frizzle Fry and Sailing the Seas of Cheese, there's definitely a lot of like metal elements, and Larry Lalonde shows off some good solid metal riffs all over the place, like Too Many Puppies, Jerry Was a Race Car Driver, Tommy the Cat. I mean, this band has a ton of hits. And even going into Pork Soda and Tales from the Punch Bowl, they would still retain some like metallic elements that would pop up and kind of just hit you out of nowhere, like, you know, Professor Nutbutter's House of Treats. I mean, that has like a good solid metal chug and a gallop that drives it. And you even have Tim Herb Alexander's drum work, which while is very funky, he actually has some like good like metallic rhythms and breakdowns that pop up. With that, there's part of me that would almost say that this band could have fit in with the funk metal crowd, like Infectious Grooves and, you know, stuff like that. Like, there was still a lot of that, and, you know, some of that stuff is kind of on the cusp itself, but it was still, you know, very much metal. And it isn't as though their sound has drastically changed over the years to the point where they don't include any metallic elements anymore. Like, you still hear it every now and then, but to call this band a metal band, I don't know, I don't think would actually work, honestly. Like, Primus is Primus, and the fans will let you know, because the fans of Primus are Primus fans. I remember the only time I actually got to see them, which was, God, years ago. I want to say, man, almost 10 years ago. Saw them with Clutch. And a former buddy of mine who had never seen them before and really didn't know that much about them outside of, they were that band that played that Beaver song that he liked. He got really pissed when people started chanting Primus sucks. And he was like, man, I want to get up and beat someone's ass. This is just disrespectful. And I was like, one, no, you're not, because that's just a completely full of shit statement. And two, this is the Primus cheer. And that was, again, part of their notoriety where, you know, the reviewers, you know, God, I feel like I'm talking shit about myself now, but they would talk shit about Primus saying they sucked. Like, they constantly got a lot of negative reviews, and it was like, they're too weird and too this and not enough that, whatever. And some of them would just say flat out, Primus sucks. So that became the band's rallying cry. And again, they became kind of another thing that was just kind of oddly charming about this band. They were uniquely them. They embraced just being strange. And they were, again, like one of those bands that were like kind of too heavy and possibly too weird for a tremendous amount of commercial success, even though they have achieved that. Despite what all the reviewers have said, like, they've actually, you know, garnered a really solid fan base. And they've even had like some charting singles and such, but Primus is just Primus. Like, I suppose I can kind of just get away with saying that for these guys. Like, in terms of their fans, they're Primus fans. Yeah, there's overlap with like metalheads too. There's overlap with like grunge fans. There's overlap with like funk fans and just prog fans too. But I wouldn't say that they are metal, even in their earlier days, like it was just kind of something different. Like it's kind of that same thing that Faith No More had. They had some metallic elements, but I would never call them flat out metal just because there was so much more going on. And they were just kind of indicative of the time that they came up where the 90s just got weird. Again, maybe with Frizzle Fry, you could throw that in the whole funk metal movement, but that was kind of short-lived and it really wasn't a lot of bands around that. It wasn't necessarily like a super huge scene, but it might work. But in terms of bands that I consider very heavy that are not considered metal, but maybe should, but can also fit elsewhere, would probably be the last one I'm bringing up here, Today Is the Day. Today Is the Day falls more under noise and ambience, though I would say there's a lot of elements of power violence and grindcore. Out of all the bands that I've brought up, this is probably the one where you could argue that, yeah, they're a metal band, and Archives, what the hell is up? Why don't you just include them? Because, like, seriously, listen to them. Their sound is consistently heavy, grating, bleak, miserable as hell. Steve Austin's distorted vocals, sounds like he is bellowing through a broken bullhorn. Honestly, I think his vocal approach heavily influenced J.R. Hayes from Pig Destroyer, which, I mean, honestly, I think some of the music probably did too, but that in particular, like you listen to J.R. Hayes, especially on Terrifier, and listen to Today Is the Day on, Temple of the Morning Star, In the Eyes of God, Pain is a Warning, Kiss the Pig, I mean, literally any of his albums, that certain distortion is so similar. And when it comes down to the music itself, like, you have blast beats, you have double time drums, you have nothing but the harshest vocals almost all the time. Like, occasionally you get some, like, very desperate crooning, but for the most part, it's just vicious. It's noisy, caustic, abrasive, all things that most people would use to describe things they don't like, but in this case, it's something that I do like here. Steve Austin is definitely the central guy in this entire thing, but along this band's career, he has invited a lot of players to come join him in terms of, like, recording albums. And probably most famously, In the Eyes of God features Bill Kelleher and Braun Daler from Mastodon. Bill is actually playing bass on this, and Braun is just doing his crazy drum thing, and honestly, it's one of the most intense drum performances of his entire career. And I'm even comparing that to the absolutely nuts, fill-ridden performance that is on Remission. That one has always been one of my favorites, but Temple of the Morning Star and its absolutely unsettling, twisting atmosphere and just raw and rotten songs. Like, I mean, yeah, I could just say, listen to The Man Who Loves to Hurt Himself, but you're only getting the tip of the weird iceberg on there. Some of the samples in there are just downright unsettling and occasionally a little pornographic. But despite this being more like akin to noise rock, I would say that this band has always been at least, God, like 70% metal. Like, noise is more or less part of the atmosphere here. When it comes down to the playing itself, I hear a lot of metal. But this also brings up the whole, like, debate between, like, noise rock and metal. Like, you know, again, another reason why Helmet is kind of on the outside is because they're considered noise rock at certain points. Same thing with bands like Unsane. While they definitely have an appeal towards fans of heavier music in general, that, you know, mostly metalheads, they are definitely more in the realm of noise rock as well. But there's also the fact that this band was also part of the early Relapse Records roster too, where, you know, Relapse Records was known for, well, I mean, death metal, of course, and just extreme metal in general, but also extreme acts in other subcategories too. And Today Is the Day kind of just fit between all of the different things they were trying to cover there, because they just embraced the darkest, noisiest, heaviest side of music they possibly could conjure up. And of course, when you look at the fan base of this band, the fan base are metalheads, like, flat out. Like, I really don't see a lot of people that don't get into metal at all that aren't into Today Is the Day. Today Is the Day is kind of like an exclusive club of just like, all right, you've made it to another level of extremity here. And yeah, it gets crazier even past this. The influence of this band, I would even say, is almost exclusively towards metal and just extreme music in general too. Like, there aren't a lot of bands out there that are, you know, like, more commercial that have listened to Today Is the Day and it's like, yeah, I want to, you know, do some stuff like that. It's like, no radio is ever going to play us ever if we do some weird shit like Tempo of the Morning Star. So to me personally, Today Is the Day is a metal band. And I mean, I can hear their influence in like Mastodon, Pig Destroyer, all that stuff. You know, there's nothing about it that doesn't feel metal. Like even in its like noisy, caustic moments, you know, you could still relate that to a band like Full of Hell, which I would still say is definitely a metal band as well. This band occupies, like, again, a unique territory in music in general and really kind of has their own thing, which is kind of a thing on this whole list here. And that was the thing that really made this appealing to go over, because a lot of these bands had a unique take on heavy music in general. And provided this video goes really well, I'll probably do another one of these because I have a giant list of bands that, again, are on the cusp or kind of in a gray area that is adjacent or near to metal, or, you know, kind of get lumped in the alt metal pile or grunge or whatever, that I think need to be talked about because I think they made like an interesting impact on music in general in terms of like heavy music and experimentation. And I know a lot of this was just kind of fun to go back over. But yeah, that does it for this part. Again, I think I'm probably going to do a part 2 of this because, again, there's a lot of bands I didn't get a chance to touch on because I wanted to keep this one relatively short, and I'm reasonably sure this one's already pretty damn long. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you are new to the channel, subscribe because we do stuff like this all the time. We are also on Patreon. If you'd like to help us out there, there's a link down below to thrallsmetal.com. Our Patreon link is there. It is also on our channel up in the banner in the bottom right-hand corner. But if you are looking for Thralls Metal stuff, you have to go to thrallsmetal.com. We have new shirts. We have old shirts that are discounted, provided we have your size. And we even have some hats, so if you're looking for any of that stuff, click the link down below. And of course, thank you guys so much for liking, subscribing, all that stuff. We just hit 17,000 subscribers not too long ago, a feat that I didn't think was absolutely possible, but I mean, if I'm being completely honest, I didn't think 1,000 subscribers was possible either. But here we are, and it is all due to you guys. It is amazing doing this. I like the fact that I think we've built like a really cool community here, and it's just amazing doing this all the time. Semi-exhausting because I do it all the time, but it's been a lot of fun, and I intend on overloading you guys with more content in the future. So one more big thank you, because you guys are awesome, and we will catch you later.